"Fuck you, Stephen." Nicolas Cage spoke with anger, his voice a jagged blade slicing through the air of the studio, each word dripping with venom as he leaned forward, eyes blazing like a wildfire, ready to consume everything in its path. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room, leaving only the raw electricity of conflict. Stephen, perched behind his polished desk, smirked, his lips curling like a snake coiling for a strike. "Oh, Nicholas," he said, his tone mocking, dripping with the kind of smugness that could make a saint lose patience. "You're just upset because your last movie flopped harder than a fish on dry land." The crowd tittered nervously, unsure whether to laugh or brace for impact. Nicholas's fists clenched, knuckles whitening as he stood, chair scraping the floor like a warning shot. "You think you're clever, Stephen? You think you can sit there, safe behind your little desk, and tear people down for laughs?" His voice rose, a thunderclap of righteous fury, each syllable a hammer striking the anvil of his rage. This wasn't just a talk show spat. This was a reckoning, a collision of two forces, one a man defending his life's work, the other a host, who thrived on cutting others to size. The argument's roots ran deep, planted months earlier when Stephen, on a late-night monologue, had ridiculed Nicholas's recent film, a passion project about a retiring boxer chasing one last fight. Nicholas had poured his soul into the role, training for months, even breaking a rib during a scene, only for Stephen to call it a tired retread of Rocky, a cheap grab for Oscars. The jab had stung, not just for its cruelty but because it came from a man Nicholas once respected, someone he'd shared laughs with over drinks years ago. Now sitting across from Stephen, Nicholas felt betrayed, like a soldier ambushed by a supposed ally. Stephen, sensing blood, leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. "Come on, Nick. You can't tell me you thought that movie was good. I mean, what was it? Your 50th attempt at a comeback?" The audience laughed, louder this time, egged on by Stephen's taunting cadence. Nicholas's jaw tightened, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You don't know what it takes, Stephen. You sit here, night after night, poking fun at people who actually create something, who put their heart into their work. You're a parasite, feeding off other people's dreams." The tension thickened, a storm cloud ready to burst. Stephen, unfazed, waved a hand dismissively as if swatting away a fly. "Dreams? Please, Nicholas, spare us the melodrama. You're an actor, not a poet. Stick to what you're good at, like yelling about bees." The reference to an old viral clip hit like a sucker punch, and the audience roared, their laughter a cruel chorus. Nicholas's face flushed, not with embarrassment but with a fury that seemed to radiate from his core. He stepped closer to the desk, his presence looming, a titan ready to topple a giant. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he said, his voice low, each word deliberate, like a prosecutor laying out a case. "You think you can mock me, mock my work, and I'll just sit here and take it? I've fought harder battles than you'll ever know, Stephen. I've clawed my way through this industry, through critics sharper than you, through failures that would have broken lesser men. And you? You're just a guy with a microphone and a bad haircut." Stephen's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a crack in his armor, but he recovered quickly, leaning back with a theatrical sigh. "Oh, Nicholas, you're so intense. Maybe if you put that energy into picking better scripts, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The audience laughed. Again. But it was uneasy now, sensing the line had been crossed. Nicholas's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You want to talk about choices, Stephen? Let's talk about yours. Let's talk about how you dodge real questions, how you hide behind jokes because you're too scared to say anything real." The crowd hushed, the air heavy with anticipation. Nicholas leaned in, his voice a controlled burn. "I came here to talk about my work, my art. But you just want to tear it down. You're not a host, Stephen. You're a bully." The word hung in the air, sharp and final, as the audience held its breath, waiting for Stephen's next move. The studio fell into a brittle silence, Nicholas's accusation of bully still echoing, like a gunshot. Stephen's face twitched, his usual polished charm cracking under the weight of the word. He leaned forward, elbows on his desk, fingers steepled, as if trying to reclaim control. "A bully?" he said, his voice sharp, like a knife slicing through the tension. "That's rich, coming from a guy who's made a career out of chewing scenery. You want real, Nicholas? Here's real. Your movies bomb because you keep picking the same tired roles. The audience doesn't want another over-the-top Cage meltdown. They're bored." Nicholas's eyes flashed, but he didn't interrupt, letting Stephen dig his own grave. The host, emboldened by the crowd's uneasy murmurs, pressed on. "You're a one-trick pony, Nick. Always have been. Always will be." Nicholas took a step back, not in retreat but like a boxer sizing up his opponent. His voice, when he spoke, was steady, a low rumble that carried the weight of years spent fighting for respect. "You think you know me, Stephen? You think you can sum up my career, my life, in a soundbite?" He paced slightly, his movements deliberate, each step a counterpoint to Stephen's smug stillness. "I've taken risks you'd never dream of. I've played heroes, villains, broken men, and dreamers. I've won awards, lost fortunes, and kept going. You? You play the same role every night. The guy who thinks he's smarter than everyone else." The audience shifted, some nodding, drawn to Nicholas's raw honesty. Stephen's smile tightened, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the crowd's mood shifting. "You're deflecting," Stephen snapped, his voice rising, a hint of desperation creeping in. "This isn't about me. It's about you, Nicholas, and your refusal to admit you're past your prime." The words were meant to wound, and they did, but Nicholas absorbed the blow like a seasoned fighter. He stopped pacing, turning to face Stephen directly, his gaze unyielding. "Past my prime?" he said, his voice slow, deliberate, each word a stone dropped into still water. "I'm still here, Stephen. I'm still making films, still telling stories, still fighting for what I believe in. Can you say the same? Or do you just sit there, night after night, tearing down people who dare to try?" The crowd murmured, a ripple of support for Nicholas, who stood tall, his presence commanding the room. Stephen, sensing the shift, slammed his hand on the desk, the sound sharp enough to make the front row flinch. "Don't lecture me about trying," he spat, his composure unraveling. "I built this show from nothing. I earned this desk, this audience. You think you can come here and play the victim? You're not special, Nicholas. You're just another washed-up star who can't handle the truth." The venom in his words was palpable, but Nicholas didn't flinch. Instead he smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of his lips that sent a chill through the room. "The truth?" he said, his voice soft but cutting. "The truth is, Stephen, you're scared. Scared of anyone who dares to be more than a punchline. Scared of someone who's still got the guts to create, to fail, to keep going. That's why you attack me, because I remind you of what you'll never be." The audience erupted in applause, a wave of support that caught Stephen off guard. His face flushed, his hands gripping the desk as he struggled to regain control. "You're delusional," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier bite, sounding almost petulant. Nicholas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet every word carried to the back of the room. "Delusional? Maybe. But I'd rather be delusional than a coward who hides behind cheap shots." The crowd roared again, louder this time, as Stephen's eyes darted to his producers offstage, a flicker of panic betraying his facade. Nicholas stood firm, his stare locked on Stephen, daring him to strike back. Nicholas's words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, as the audience's applause swelled like a tide crashing against a crumbling shore. Stephen's eyes flickered with unease, his fingers twitching on the desk, as he scrambled to regain his footing. The crowd's support for Nicholas was a slap he hadn't expected, and for a moment his polished mask slipped, revealing a man cornered. He forced a laugh, brittle and hollow, and leaned back in his chair, trying to project ease. "You're good at playing the martyr, Nicholas," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "But it won't change the facts. Your career's a circus, and you're the main act, stumbling through one bad choice after another." The audience stirred, some booing softly, their loyalty shifting like sand under Stephen's feet. Nicholas didn't move, his stance rooted, a pillar of defiance in the storm of Stephen's words. He tilted his head, studying the host like a scientist examining a failed experiment. "You keep talking about my choices, Stephen," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel, each syllable precise. "But let's talk about yours. Let's talk about how you pick your guests, how you set them up to fail, how you twist their words for a quick laugh. You think that's power? That's weakness," the crowd murmured, a low rumble of agreement as Nicholas's words struck a chord. He took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. "I came here to share my story, to talk about a film that means something to me. But you turned it into a trap. You don't want a conversation? You want a fight." Stephen's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he shot to his feet, abandoning the safety of his desk. "A fight?" he snapped, his voice rising, sharp enough to cut through the crowd's murmurs. "You're the one who came out swinging, Nicholas. Don't act like you're above this. You're here because you need the exposure, because your little boxing movie's tanking, and you know it." The accusation was a low blow, meant to sting, and it did. Nicholas's eyes narrowed, but his voice stayed steady, a quiet force that carried more weight than Stephen's shouting. "My film's not tanking, Stephen. It's honest. It's about a man who keeps fighting no matter the odds. Something you wouldn't understand, because you've never fought for anything but ratings." The audience erupted, cheers mixing with gasps, as Stephen's face flushed a deep red. He stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them, his hands balled into fists. "Don't lecture me about fighting," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "I've earned everything I have. You think you're some kind of hero because you made a movie? You're a has-been, Nicholas, clinging to a career that's been dead for years." The words were meant to crush, but Nicholas stood taller, his gaze unflinching, a warrior facing down a snarling beast. "A has-been?" he said, his voice soft, almost pitying. "Maybe. But I'm still standing. I'm still creating. I'm still taking risks. You're just tearing people down to feel big. That's not a career, Stephen. That's a tantrum." The crowd roared, their cheers shaking the room as Stephen's composure shattered. He jabbed a finger at Nicholas, his voice trembling with rage. "You don't get to come on my show and talk to me like that," he shouted, his words tripping over each other. "This is my stage, my rules." Nicholas didn't flinch, his smile faint but defiant, a spark of triumph in his eyes. "Your stage?" he said, his voice cutting through Stephen's outburst like a blade through silk. "Then why are you so scared of me?" The question landed like a thunderbolt, silencing Stephen for a heartbeat. The audience leaned forward, breathless, as the two men stood inches apart, the air between them crackling with unspoken challenges. The studio crackled with raw energy, the space between Nicholas and Stephen a battlefield where words were weapons, and silence was a dare. Stephen's fingers still hovered in the air, his face twisted with fury. But Nicholas's question, "Why are you so scared of me?" had struck a nerve, leaving the host momentarily speechless. The audience held its breath, their cheers fading into a tense hush, as if the room itself awaited the next blow. Stephen's eyes darted to the crowd, then back to Nicholas, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. "Scared?" he spat, stepping closer, his breath hot with defiance. "I'm not scared of you, Nicholas. I'm embarrassed for you, showing up here, pretending you're still relevant, when everyone knows you're a joke." The words were a venomous jab, meant to draw blood, but Nicholas's face remained steady, his eyes burning with a quiet, unyielding strength. Nicholas tilted, his chin, his voice low, each word carved with precision. "A joke?" he said, his tone carrying the weight of a man who'd faced worse and survived. "I've been called worse by better men than you, Stephen." The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock and admiration as Nicholas continued, his voice growing stronger like a fire catching wind. "I've spent my life telling stories, taking chances, bearing my soul. You call that a joke? I call it courage, something you've never had the guts to try." Stephen flinched, the insult landing like a slap, but he recovered quickly, his voice rising to a near shout. "Courage? You call those B-movies courage? You're a walking meme, Nicholas, and you don't even see it." The audience stirred, some booing, their loyalty to Nicholas solidifying as Stephen's cruelty laid bare. Nicholas took a measured step forward, closing the gap until they were nearly chest to chest, his presence towering despite Stephen's height. "You want to talk about memes?" he said, his voice a controlled burn, each word searing. "Let's talk about you, Stephen. Hiding behind your desk, your jokes, your audience. You think you're safe because you've got a crowd to laugh at your barbs? Look at them now." He gestured to the audience, who erupted in cheers, their support, a tidal wave crashing over Stephen's crumbling defenses. "They see you, Stephen. They see a man who tears down others because he's too weak to build anything himself." Stephen's face paled, his hands shaking as he tried to interrupt, but Nicholas pressed on, relentless. "You invited me here to mock me, but you're the one exposed. You're the one who's small." Stephen staggered back as if physically struck, his voice cracking as he tried to rally. "This is my show!" he shouted, but the words sounded hollow, desperate, a child throwing a tantrum. "You don't get to come here and lecture me." Nicholas didn't budge, his gaze locked on Stephen, unyielding. "Your show," he said, his voice soft, but piercing, cutting through the noise. "Then why does it feel like I'm the one in control?" The audience roared, their cheers deafening, as Stephen's eyes widened, panic flickering across his face. He glanced at his producers, who stood frozen off stage, then back at Nicholas, who stood like a statue, unshaken, unbreakable. "You're nothing," Stephen hissed, but his voice was weak, a dying ember compared to Nicholas's fire. "You're just a loudmouth who's run out of tricks." Nicholas shook his head, a faint smile playing on his lips, not of amusement, but of pity. "No, Stephen," he said, his voice steady, resonant, carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm a man who's still fighting, still creating, still standing. You're just noise." The crowd exploded, their applause a thunderous wave, as Stephen stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, his world unraveling. Nicholas turned, as if to walk away, but paused, his back to Stephen, the tension between them a live wire ready to spark. Nicholas stood with his back to Stephen, the air thick with the weight of his final words, the audience's roar still echoing like a victory cry. The pause stretched, heavy with expectation, as every eye in the room locked on him, waiting for his next move. Stephen, gripping his desk, his face a mask of barely contained rage, tried to seize the moment. "You can't just walk away, Nicholas," he shouted, his voice cracking, a desperate attempt to claw back control. "This is my show, my rules. You think you can humiliate me and just leave?" The plea was raw, almost pitiful, but it only fueled the crowd's fervor, their cheers swelling for Nicholas, who turned slowly, his eyes blazing with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "You're right, Stephen," Nicholas said, his voice steady, a calm sea after a storm. "I could walk away, but I'm not here to run. I'm here to finish this." He stepped forward, his presence commanding, a warrior claiming the battlefield. "You invited me to your show to tear me down, to make me a punchline. But you forgot one thing. I don't break." The audience erupted, their applause a deafening wave, as Nicholas's words rang with the truth of a man who'd faced countless battles and emerged stronger. Stephen's eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape, but there was none. Nicholas continued, his voice rising, each word a hammer striking the final nail. "I've spent my life fighting for my art, for my truth. I've taken risks, faced failure, and kept going. You hide behind your desk, throwing stones at people braver than you'll ever be." Stephen stumbled back, his hands raised as if to ward off the words. "That's enough," he yelled, but his voice was drowned by the crowd's cheers, their loyalty now fully with Nicholas. "You don't get to rewrite the story, Nicholas. You're nothing without my platform." The desperation in his tone was stark, a man watching his empire crumble. Nicholas shook his head, his smile one of quiet triumph, not gloating but certain. "Your platform?" he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a beacon. "I don't need your stage, Stephen. I've got my work, my passion, my fight. You're the one who needs me, needs someone to mock to feel big. But tonight, you picked the wrong man." The crowd roared louder, some standing, their applause a tidal wave of support. Stephen's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging as he sank back against his desk, defeated. Nicholas turned to the audience, his gaze sweeping over them, warm and grateful. "Thank you," he said, his voice softening but still resonant. "Thank you for seeing me, for seeing the truth. I make movies for you, for people who believe in stories, in heart, in fighting on." The cheers grew deafening, a celebration of a man who'd turned the tables, who'd faced a bully and won. Nicholas looked back at Stephen one last time, his eyes not cruel but firm. "I'm done here," he said, his voice final, a door closing. "You can keep your desk, Stephen. I've got work to do." With that, he walked off the stage, his head high, each step a declaration of victory. The audience leapt to their feet, their ovation shaking the room as Stephen stood alone, his head bowed, the weight of his defeat etched in every line of his face. The cameras followed Nicholas as he disappeared into the wings, a hero who'd faced the fire and emerged unburned. The crowd's cheers carried him out, a testament to his resilience, his courage, his unbreakable spirit. Backstage, Nicholas paused, taking a deep breath, his heart steady. He'd come to share his story, and instead, he'd reclaimed his power, leaving Stephen to face the silence of a stage no longer his own.